We've all witnessed Donald Trump cozy up to the world's dictators and fascists, including Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who ordered the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and North Korea's Kim Jong-un, who continues with his provocative missile tests. There's no question that Trump has an affinity for terrible people, and Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro is no exception.
We look forward to an even deeper partnership and working together. In our meetings, we also discussed the strong economic ties between our nations grounded in the principles of fairness and reciprocity. My favorite word, reciprocity.
Who cares what his favorite words are? I mean, anyway. Bolsonaro was sworn in as the president of Brazil on January of 2019, and he's a member of the conservative social liberal party. Like Trump, he polls poorly among women, with some polls indicating that only 18% of female voters supported him. In a speech in April of 2017, Bolsonaro said that he had 5 children, the first 4 of whom were male. He then mentioned that the only daughter he has was conceived out of a moment of weakness. Journalist Glenn Greenwald called Bolsonaro, quote, the most misogynistic, hateful elected official in the democratic world. His disdain for women is matched by his hatred for the gay community. He believed that if a gay couple moved into his neighborhood, it would actually lower property values in that very neighborhood. In a June 2011 interview with Playboy, Bolsonaro said, quote, I would be incapable of loving a gay son. He also added that he would prefer any gay son of his to, quote, die in an accident. As a side note, after agreeing to appear in a pro-Bolsonaro propaganda video, Dave Rubin, who's gay married, as he's like to remind us every possible moment, answered the following question about Bolsonaro this way.
What is your opinion on Brazilian Prime Minister Bolsonaro regarding, oops, there's a lot of things moving here, deforestation of the rainforest? P.S. I'm a Christian, I'd bake you a cake though. I don't know enough about him, but it sounds like he really hates Marxism and he's really pushing Brazil to become more of a world leader, and that he actually is for capitalism, and he's trying to get some of the SJW stuff out of the schools. I just saw a tweet by him a day or two ago. So on that front, and I don't know a ton about him, that all sounds good to me.
Yeah, if you just appeared in a propaganda video supporting Bolsonaro, maybe you should learn what his name is and you should learn what his positions are. That's one of my favorite videos of all time. But we just scratched the surface with Bolsonaro. He's most notably known for his strong opposition to left-wing policies, including environmental regulations, immigration from Haiti, Africa, and the Middle East, which he once called the scum of humanity, drug legalization, land reform, secularism, gun control. And what exactly does he support? Well, the list is pretty long. Torture, privatizing state-owned companies, more lethal force by police, abortion bans, the Brazilian military regime, which committed human rights abuses, austerity, regime change wars, demarcation of indigenous lands. I mean, this guy can't get any worse. And while I'm not an expert on Brazilian politics, luckily, I know one man who is. Here to discuss the rise of Jair Bolsonaro and the politically charged imprisonment of his top opponent, Lula da Silva, is Michael Brooks, host of The Michael Brooks Show. Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Anna, it's always a pleasure. I appreciate the reciprocity with you always.
I like that word, reciprocity.
It's a great word. And the Dave Rubin clip, I mean, come on. We're already off to the races.
I mean, I couldn't have an interview with you where we don't have at least a single moment where we dunk on Dave Rubin. So I had to put that in.
I appreciate that.
So let's get started with the important stuff. I actually want to kind of back up a little bit and talk about the rise of Bolsonaro, who Bolsonaro is, and the type of legal issues he faced well before he ran for president. So he was actually detained for 15 days because he had apparently planned to plant bombs in Rio de Janeiro. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Jair Bolsonaro was an army captain. He was in the Brazilian military at a low level, but he was in it actually during the military dictatorship, which still existed in the 80s. So it's important, we can talk about a lot of leaders being in a fascist or authoritarian tradition, including, I would definitely say, Donald Trump, obviously. But Jair Bolsonaro literally served in a military dictatorship that the phrase neo-fascism was actually coined to describe, very specifically in Brazil. In the mid 80s, though, even though he has a lot of worship for the military, he was angry about not getting paid enough. And instead of saying maybe I should look at labor organizing or other things, he was actually detained for plans to plant multiple bombs at army barracks in Rio de Janeiro, and also potentially a water supply as well. And he ended up being cleared after a long process. But the initial military investigation, they said, look, he lied every step of the way, and he was planning to do this.
So he eventually was acquitted by the Brazilian Supreme Court in 1988. And that's important to mention because in a recent foreword that you wrote for a book about Bolsonaro and Lula da Silva, you wrote, quote, understanding the tactics of lawfare, the misuse of corruption as a tool to elevate far-right politics, and the ways in which the extremes of Brazil's situation reflect and parallel our global predicament is essential. So I want to talk about the legal system in Brazil and some of the corruption that plays a role there, because not only have they helped with the rise of Bolsonaro, but they also have helped him do away with political opponents. So let's back up and talk a little bit about Dilma Rousseff and what happened to her.
So Dilma Rousseff was president of Brazil from 2010, I believe, to 2016, when she was actually impeached and removed from office midway through her second term. She was from the same main opposition party, which is the Workers' Party, the PT, which is known primarily by the leadership of Lula da Silva, who was president from 2 terms from 2003 to 2010. And we'll get to him in a minute, I think. But Rousseff was his successor. And she was impeached in 2016 for essentially, literally a budgetary, I don't even know if you call it, I mean, standard practice in Brazil, which is that she basically took money from the central bank, which was paid back in full. That was never part of the accusation. And she used it to plug a deficit in a government department. So this is a practice that all other Brazilian presidents had done. And she was impeached by people in the Brazilian Congress who had like murder and drug trafficking charges aimed at them as well. And it was clearly a political process. You know, the right wing in Brazil had lost 4 consecutive elections to Dilma, or to the Workers' Party rather, to Lula and Dilma. And this was the move. And it would be like analogous if Barack Obama was like removed from office for like putting out a faulty CBO score or something.
You described the ouster of Rousseff as a judicial coup. Can you elaborate on that a little more?
Well, maybe I should say, I mean, it was a congressional coup, I should say, I guess to be more specific. But yes, I mean, look, this whole process fits into something called Lava Jato, right? Which is this car wash investigation. And it's an investigation that began several years ago in Brazil and exposed some significant corruption. Now, this is another really important distinction I think we got to draw, because first, there's a huge amount of corruption structurally in the Brazilian system, right? As there is in the United States and elsewhere. But Brazil, as an example, there's multiple small political parties, right? And that doesn't mean the system is better. That means that, like, Anna, you and I could start like the dopest on YouTube political party and just get in Congress and say, okay, we'll vote for your packages if you pay us off. So actually, one of the first major scandals that sort of implicated the Lula government involved paying off other, legislators, but it was in fact to pass legislation like labor protections, minimum wage increases, and expanding college access. So part of this is like, this is a structural corruption in the system that implicates everybody and structurally, and it was weaponized and used and targeted to focus on eliminating the left. In fact, Dilma's impeachment had nothing to do with Lava Jato, but it was in the air. And even though people always report that Lula's conviction has to do with Lava Jato, that didn't really have to do with Lava Jato either. So at each step of the way, there's been a double standard with the courts and with political leadership in Brazil in terms of like how this stuff is actually played out.
So let's talk a little bit about who Lula da Silva is, because he had widespread support among voters in Brazil. I believe over 80% of voters approved of the job that he had done, and he was the front runner until he was prosecuted and then convicted allegedly of corruption. And I say allegedly because there was little to no evidence linking him to any type of corruption. So I want you to kind of talk a little bit about that and the reasons why da Silva was targeted.
Well, I think it's really important because it's like, I think there's three different things that this story tells us, right? So one is it's getting back to getting real about the role of the United States in Latin America. It's actually really funny because Dave Rubin, in his like perfect idiot way, when he had that line about making Brazil respected again in the world, Lula actually did develop an independent Brazilian foreign policy. And it was actually he was a guy who was very committed to getting along with and sort of making deals with everybody he could. So he had a point where he had decent relations with George Bush and with Ahmadinejad, as well as his like left partners in what was called the pink tide in Latin America. But he was committed to protecting core Brazilian natural resources from privatization and Western investment, even though he ran a very moderate government, but he was not willing to open up certain strategic like oil assets, offshore assets as an example. Mm-hmm. He used state-owned firms, which is what a lot of these corruption investigations targeted, but he used them in very innovative ways to be a tool of Brazilian foreign policy in places like Africa. And then the money would actually migrate back to Brazil to fund social programs. This is a president who brought 40 million people out of poverty, which is to me, that makes him the best president of the 21st century. So you have this context where even though he was not, again, very moderate in many ways, but a genuine social democrat and not willing to sacrifice key geostrategic resources. So there's that part of it. Then there's the fact that all of these right-wing leaders have gotten into power talking about corruption. It's not just Bolsonaro. Trump talked about draining the swamp.
Right.
Modi's talked about it. Duterte. And so what you do is when you create this like moralistic, simplistic universe of like, oh, there's corruption and it's bad, and some gangster figure can come and clean it up, you're not looking at the structure of how corruption works, whether it be capitalism itself, or like in a place like Brazil. Ironically, Lula was praised all over the American press when he first got into office because he was like this radical labor leader. And they were like, look at him, like he's still delivering for people, but he's making deals and he's become pragmatic. Well, part of how you become pragmatic in Brazil is you make deals that sometimes are like definitionally you're dealing with corrupt forces. So that's like the bigger backdrop. And really quickly, what he's actually in jail for, he was leading in the polls in 2018 elections. He was a double-digit lead. Now, he left office with an 86% approval rating. That had definitely gone down because there was this huge campaign legally and in the media, which is also totally concentrated in Brazil. It's like basically having like several Fox News's target at you with no major counterforce. He still had a huge amount of support amongst the lower classes, and he still led. He led by double digits in spite of all of that. They put him in jail for taking a seaside apartment, which sounds really glamorous. The place is actually like a little, and I guess not even like Hoboken, because Hoboken is gentrified as hell. Mm-hmm. But it would be like maybe like Fort Lauderdale, little tiny condo. There was no paperwork that he and his wife owned it, and it was solely based off testimony of a Otterbrecht executive that they had put in preventative detention. And so he literally was put in jail for what they called indeterminate acts. The prosecutor who put him in jail is now Bolsonaro's justice minister. Mm-hmm. And that whole Lava Jato team has basically, the Justice Department of the United States has funneled them the civil penalty, a chunk of the civil penalties, which they've won against Brazilian companies, into this like unaccountable political slush fund. So Lula, two-term president, internationally recognized, the leading candidate, was silenced. He was put in jail. He was put in solitary confinement. They wouldn't let him do public interviews. and they prevented him from running for president on, and again, this is a country where other politicians are definitely facing radically more serious charges, and they don't necessarily get trial dates for years. They certainly are allowed to stay at home. And and you will still see in the press so many reports saying he was convicted on like money laundering charges, and he wasn't.
Right.
It just wasn't what he's convicted on. There's a lot of accusations, but literally all they've put forward is, he was in this seaside apartment. And then there was another land accusation, and the judge in that case copied and pasted part of the decision from the first case, literally.
It's incredible. And I don't understand how the people of Brazil don't see through this, especially considering how transparent it is, right? Because you have Judge Sergio Moro, the person who basically did Bolsonaro's bidding in the case against Lula, now serving as the foreign minister in Bolsonaro's regime. And so, what is the reaction of the Brazilian electorate? Are there any talks of uprisings, any real opposition to Bolsonaro? Is there any political activism planned? What's going on with the electorate?
Yeah, actually, in the last month, it's been awesome. There have been huge protests in Brazil, particularly fighting against his plans to gut the public education system. And of course, in the last couple of months, there's been a lot of revelations of like the Bolsonaro family actual serious corruption scandals. Like there was an assassination of a woman named Marielle Franco. People should look her up. She was an amazing emerging young leader. She was assassinated in a professional hit. Her and her driver were murdered, and recently former police officers connected to one of the most dangerous kind of like paramilitary drug gangs in Rio were arrested. And there's photos of people like the triggermen with members of Bolsonaro's family. There's serious money laundering accusations against Bolsonaro's son. Of course, Judge Sergio Moro, the justice minister who put Lula in jail in this transparently political way, has nothing to say about this stuff. So there's been huge protests. Bolsonaro is very unpopular, but definitely all the things he talked about are, they're ticking up. There's even higher rates of police violence against people, which is already a huge problem to begin with. And I think it's really important to remember that the Wall Street Journal endorsed Bolsonaro, that going back to 2009, when Hillary Clinton endorsed a coup in Honduras, that the US has definitely been working to undermine these governments in Latin America. And the other thing about Lula, though, that's interesting is like he is the type of politician that everybody, even on like the center left, should be watching and listening to right now, because he actually had a formula for winning. And he actually has a very down to earth and charismatic speaking style and vision. Like the exact antidote to people like Trump is actually, in that Lula style. And obviously I think, there are other candidates who have this, but he's someone that we need to be listening to now. And he's a political prisoner, and it's incredible how lazy the reporting is. The only other thing I'll say is there's a huge pushback in Brazil, but I think there's no doubt that in the, it's like people would say to me like, oh, when I say something about Lula, there'll be like this pushback on social media or something, although I think that's actually kind of changing. And it's like, look, the base of the Workers' Party was still, again, 40 million people that were taken out of poverty. The fact that hunger was eliminated as an issue in Brazil until now it's an issue again. But the people who are the base of the Workers' Party, whether or not they're like a bus driver or like a super rural impoverished farmer, or someone as a part of the landless workers movement, these people are probably not sitting around YouTube saying like, you don't get it, he's corrupt.
That's right. That's a great point. It's a great point. Michael, thank you for the work that you do in general, but specifically on this topic, because I gotta be honest with you, if Americans rely solely on mainstream American media, they would have no idea what's happening in Brazil. And you're absolutely right in that, you had publications like the Wall Street Journal help to push someone like Bolsonaro into power. And so I really encourage everyone watching this or listening to this right now to check out the Michael Brooks Show. He's on Patreon. You cover such a wide variety of issues and you really get into the historical events that led to where we are today. So everyone check out his show. It's called The Michael Brooks Show. And Michael, again, thank you so much for joining us.
Anna, I'm honored. It's always awesome doing stuff with you. You do amazing work, and we'll be back at it soon with, I'm sure, even a little bit more Dave Duncan.
Of course, it's our favorite. All right, talk soon. Oh, you know you want to see more videos like this. Just subscribe to the channel below. And don't forget to become a TYT member and download the TYT Plus app on your phone. Head over to tyt.com/join today.